Good morning and welcome to this week's recruitment discussion with Jump. And this week we're going to talk about fees and how to generate more fees in this type of market, or higher fees, more consistent fees in this type of market. So, as always, if you're watching on YouTube, thank you very much. And if you haven't already subscribed, please do so. But as always, let's always jump into some facts to sort of set this topic off, because I think it's facts that really sort of help drive the information and drive the conversation that we're doing. So the average perm search takes nearly 5 weeks. Retained search takes twice as long, and temp on-site is usually within 72 hours. And that was from a survey by Standout CV of 497 UK recruitment professionals that basically said that, recruitment is steady, it's slowing down, but it said the temp workers by contrast, can be sourced a lot quicker than perm workers, and that's the marginal difference is huge. It's the difference between a commercial model entirety, and it says the UK data shows 68% of the fill rate is in exclusive and assigned work, and only 31% for the most contingent recruitment agencies. So 68 versus 31% fill rate. So that's not a difference in the quality of recruiter. That's a difference in the commitment from your clients. And so we've got to look at the difference in the commitment of your client. Fact two was temp billings just hit the strongest growth in over 3 years. So every region in the UK is showing growth stimulation for the first time since 2022. And the agencies that benefit from that are the first to really sort of come out of recession. And that's come from the KPMG and REC report of May 2026. So it showed that that's the first time since December 2022 that every region in the UK has reported a growth in the temp marketplace. And the agencies are seeing the sharpest growth in the market that are, good standard agencies that are dealing with lots of good clients, and they're the ones that embed themselves in the relationships, and they're the ones who get called first. And that again was brought out from that sort of information, that it was about the quality of your relationship with your client, not the quality of the relationship of your service. Fact three: 4 in 10 UK employers have made a counter offer. Now, we talked about this last week. If the average perm search is taking 5 weeks of an unbilled consultant's time, the answer then obviously is not about having a better negotiation script. It's about having better candidate relationships. And this came out of the CIPD Labour Market Outlook, and it was based on the YouGov report of 2003 HR decision makers. And it said it found 40% of the UK employers have made a counter offer in the last 12 months. 51% of that, 51% of those are doing more than they did before. So if the average time to hire is 4.9 weeks and the placement is being killed by the counter offer, then how much money are we actually losing? So under retained service, you think the retained service at 68% and are 31% at the normal contingency, then that's a very big difference, and something that we should be looking at, that the counter offer is becoming more and more prevalent in the marketplace. And what do we do from there? And the final stat is the medium UK contractor day rate is £540. So if the agency placing 10 contractors at 15% will probably earn around about 4 grand per week in reoccurring revenue. Agencies commanding the higher margins are not the one on the longest shortlists. And this came out of IT Job Watch on June 2026. So it says that it's 540 across the UK, rising to 550 in London, and it's around about £800 per day for senior AI developers, etc. So we can see the thing from there. But if you look at that margin at 15%, that's £81 a day. So I say that's 10 contractors, it's 4 grand a week from there. So what we've got to start to think, that the contract model doesn't pay on placement, it pays every week the worker is on site, compounding across every contractor on your book. And an agency commanding the strongest margins in the marketplace are the ones with the largest candidate pool. So again, it links back to that candidate pool. And they're the ones with preferred supply agreements. They're the ones that built a track record, and they're the ones that clients turn to because they've already got a deep relationship. So we're going to talk about a lot of things that we've talked about in the past, but we're going to try and make them a little bit different. Dave's back with me today. Dave and I enjoyed ourselves in London on Monday, but I'm glad to be back up north, where it's slightly cooler than it is where Dave is in London. But here we go. So, first question, Dave. Agency owners have watched their contingency fees get squeezed before, and the markets always seem to have bounced back. But what's different about that in 2026? Why should leaders believe the pressure on contingency fee is structural rather than cyclical, particularly given that in-house teams now have been improving for years and years without killing the model?
I mean, I think the first thing to say is if you have a quality candidate and a strong relationship with that candidate and a good relationship with your client, you will continue to be successful in permanent recruitment. So there is somewhat of a structural change going on because the rise of AI has helped some of the processes make it easier for the clients so they don't feel the need to justify fees that they're paid to some recruiters. There is a rise in the number of recruiters still trying to place permanent people and trying to chip away at a little bit of the market. But the companies that are winning are still the solid companies that have a solid relationship and a good engagement. And when we talk about, or you spoke about how 4 out of 10 experiencing counter offers, a lot of the clients that we work with absolutely are experiencing that as well. So it's about the candidate control. That is a really important part of permanent recruitment. And knowing that the candidate you've got, you know what they're doing, you know what the background is, you know why they're moving, the culture fit, all the bits that AI can't do, that we can do as humans, matter more than ever now. And as long as your relationship is strong, then you can do good business. Where you are one of 5 working on 20 requirements, of which you may fill a fifth, of which half may get counter offered, that's where the struggle is going to be in this market.
It's interesting. So I looked at it from perm and contract, and I think on perm, AI is enabling in-house teams to source and screen candidates without
Yeah.
recruitment agencies. On temp, workforce apps and gig platforms are filling shifts now without recruiters involved. And on contract, if you look at AI aggregators, are profiling and ranking available contractors in seconds. So every single service line that is being automated around you from a different direction at the same time is sort of eating into our pie, and clients thinks that they can do that. So clients are not squeezing the fees because they're mean; they're squeezing them because they have more information, they have more alternatives, they have, and I think a lot of them are less loyal than they were at any point in the last decade to us because they feel that they can do it for us. So a perm client ran their own processes last quarter, a temp client tried to an app last month, and a contract client sourced someone new from LinkedIn last week. They all came back, but they all know now that they have options. So they'll still keep coming to recruitment agencies, but they have options. And I'm seeing this all the time that where some of my clients are saying, a client rang me up and said, I'm looking for this type of person, but we're going to do our own search first. I just want to see what type the market's like. So they're coming to ask you the question, but then they're going out elsewhere. So you think that contingency perm model was built on, I suppose, information asymmetry. Your contract temp markup was built on speed and compliance of the infrastructure, and your contract margin was built on your specialist market knowledge. All 3 foundations now are being sort of eroded simultaneously, and most agencies only worried about one of them. They're only worried about the percentage margin. They're not worried about why it's been eroded or how it's been eroded. They just know it's been eroded, but they're not doing anything to change that. So I think we've got to start to think that any agency owners who think AI is only a perm problem, they haven't looked at what's happening on their temp desk or their contract desk with regards to rates and margins, because they don't think that that's going to affect that, where it's actually affecting across the whole marketplace. And I think we need to sort of address it from a whole market point of view. So if we move on, when you look specifically at the impact of AI on in-house hiring capabilities, where do you see it showing up most visibly in terms of what our clients are willing to pay for? And are there sectors or role types where contingent recruitment is already becoming almost impossible to defend a fee that makes the business viable?
Well, I think you use the word loyalty in your answer to that last question. I think more than ever we have to prove our worth as recruiters. We have to prove why we deserve loyalty, both to the candidate and to the client. And if we can demonstrate that, then our fees are reasonably well protected. And in some cases, they can go up. Because if you're in a market with scarce skills that are difficult to attract and you can show that, then you will deserve the fee you get and the clients will pay it. I'm working with clients who haven't seen any degradation in their fees at all. And in fact, they've got closer to the client by showing how it's easier and better for them to work with fewer agencies than have a PSL of 10 and it goes out to 5 of them on a rota basis. So, yes, the dynamics are changing, the shifts are changing. AI is helping us to source candidates faster, but the bits that we do that AI can't do, we have to understand that the client needs to know that and understand that. If they've made a choice to go down the AI route as much as they can, and therefore don't really need the agencies, well, then our choice is, do we want to continue in that way, or do we want to focus on where the money is, where the niche skills are, or where the where the candidates are scarce? Because if you could do that, there's still a business. The volume higher, which go to some of the workforce boards that you've spoken about, Howard, and some of the higher volume, lower fees. Well, you've got to make a decision as the leader of your business whether that's a market that you want to be in. Can you compete competitively? What is your cost base in that new look market? Because you still may be able to make more money on lower fees, but obviously you've got to have a lower cost base. The commission you pay to your salespeople, that may have to change, but you can still operate. There's just a number of levers you've got to look at it. What you can't do is just think that the way you did it before is the way that you can continue to do it. You just need to embrace the tools that are available to you, the opportunities, and decide structurally in your business and strategically what market do I want to go for and how best can I find those skills.
It's interesting that comment about the market and having choice. I think the most dangerous assumption now that a recruitment agency is making is that specific clients will never go direct when they're already going direct on
Yeah,
the
they
easier
are.
parts.
Yeah,
And so
yeah.
the question is whether you have made yourself indispensable enough on the harder parts to stop them going further. So I don't think AI is killing recruitment.
No.
I think it's killed the easy part of recruitment, which is the part that most recruitment agencies have been charging for: volume, speed, etc. So if you think about the volume of a perm roll, routine shift cover, the speed of doing that, you think about the standard contractor profiles, it's all becoming automatable, and it's all become available to the clients as well. So I think clients are cutting perm fees because they already have maybe LinkedIn Recruiter, or they have created a bot in ChatGPT or Claude or Copilot to go out and infiltrate the market and look for candidates. You think about that temp market, clients are cutting temp margin because they have workforce management apps. And it's really interesting speaking to some of our clients who are working with the bigger suppliers. They are now thinking, well, if I can payroll my temp personally, okay, because the way the change in the market's gone and the change in the laws, etc., then I can cut my temp margin out from, or my temp fee out from my contract agency or my temp agency and working from there. So we're starting to see people do that, and I'm starting to see the bigger clients. And when I'm talking to some of the smaller agencies who are working with bigger clients and third-party PSLs, they're starting to see that's happening, that they're doing that and going down that right route. Okay, so I think in a perm role, the roles that still command a premium fee are the ones that require judgment, relationship, specialization. And we've got to start to think about how we do that. In the temp, your margin can still be defended based on the compliance and how heavy is your compliance, but also based on specialization and time critical placements. And those things are happening in contract where your margin is niche. And this is what I'm seeing. I'm seeing the generic contract roles be reduced, but I'm seeing your really hard to find to skill contract roles, they're starting to grow and the margins are starting to grow in them as well. And so most agents are still trying to compete on the easy stuff rather than flipping to the client and saying, this is the stuff that we actually do, we actually see. And you go speak to a client about any of those roles, things like compliance never comes up, things such as ISO never comes up, things such as uh, you know, the cost of running the contractor never comes up because they don't think about those things where now they are. And I think we've got to start to challenge our clients on the difficult part of recruitment because they're getting pulled into the easy part, thinking everything else will fall from that when it doesn't. And we know that for a fact. But clients will have a go, and they always have a go when the money's tight to do it themselves. But now they've got some proper tools to help them do it themselves. So we've got to stop fooling ourselves that sometimes those clients may never come back to us because they can do it easier and quicker themselves.
Yeah, yeah.
Let's look at this from an agency point of view. Most agency owners who look at the numbers between contingency and retained will tell you that they already know the difference and that they know they are working towards making a shift, but the data suggests that they're not. They're just still doing contingency recruitment. So, what are the agency owners measuring in their business that actively blinds them from being a true or looking at a true cost of staying contingent versus the true cost of going to a retained service? Why are they looking at the numbers so differently? Why can't they see the opportunity is there and the value is there?
Well, I think for many, Howard, that they can see the opportunity and the value, but perm is so inherent in their identity. Their cost base is so weighed towards perm delivery that if they decide to go down the retained route, they have two choices to make. Do we do contingent and a little bit of retained? Do we do all retained and not contingent? Therefore, we have to change our structure, we have to change our cost base. And do we have the people that can sell a proper retained offering? And that is where a lot of companies get a little bit stuck because they'll say have a team of four, and then they may say strategically we're going to only offer retained. Well, that team of four, unless you upskill them, unless they're trained to sell retained, unless they accept that it may take them a little bit longer to get some of the work, and there may not be as much volume, yeah, they may start to look for other work. They may start to look for other jobs. And there's a risk there of, well, I could lose my team. And what happens then? So if you're running a business, you're thinking of all the negatives that could happen. Whereas actually to make the shift to selling retained, could that be under a different brand? Could that be as a search? Could that be somewhere where you bring in some expertise to help you get there and you do it slowly but surely? And I think a lot of owners have just put that off for quite some time. If you go onto LinkedIn, there are so many consultants and training organizations trying to sell or trying to offer retained search is the way to do it. And of course, it absolutely makes sense that you offer retained search, but it's a different sell, it's a different model, it's a different commission, it's a different behavior. Yeah. And if woven into your identity is the old, it's difficult to move to the new unless you take it in steps or you make a very, very blunt decision to say this is what we do. But that could be costly from a monetary point of view. But over time, it certainly won't be costly from a value point of view.
It's interesting how you put it there. And I think most agencies know their total billings, but very few know their effect on their margin per perm placement after cost of sale. So their net margin per temp shift after NI or holiday pay and payroll costs, or their true profit per contractor placement after compliance or account management overheads. And I think once you understand those three numbers, once you take away the costs, then you actually see what you're making per placement or per shift or per contractor, etc. And we tend to just look at the overall fee. 550 quid sounds an awful lot of money to be paying a contract. You're putting 15% on top of that. But when you look at that 15% and you start to deduct all the cost out of that, is that 15% actually making you money? Is it profitable, etc.? And one thing that we've seen and one of the things we've talked about before is that we know that margins tend not to have risen over the last 20, 30 years. However, the cost of recruitment certainly has. But that cost is being borne by us and worn by us, but we're not doing that. So I think we need to look at the true cost of a perm and what it costs for lost fees, the true cost of temp margin. Are we giving it away because we don't know the actual cost of running that temp line? And then we look at the sort of the contract marketplace, how that compounds things, and are we pushing back to our clients so they understand that? Because at the moment we are absorbing all the costs, and because we're absorbing all the costs, we tend to not think about, well, if they reduce our fees by 1 or 2%, we tend not to worry about that when actually we should, because our costs are growing and they're reducing fees. So you're right, a new operation. So whether you're supplying perm, contract, or temp, because I think you can do a version of retained or type of retained business on all three, and charging from it differently gives the client a better understanding of what you're doing. And I think the clients are still in that mindset of, I'm better to have 4 agencies than have one. But the smart agencies and the smart clients are understanding if they work hand in glove with the right agency, then they'll get a better service, better quality of candidate, and therefore a better quality of overall ROI on recruitment. And that's the thing that we tend not to measure, the overall ROI of recruitment. We measure it a little bit on perm, but never on contract and never on temp, when actually we should be measuring it on there, because then we can show the value of our business, and therefore we can potentially drive up our fees rather than have our fees eroded whilst our costs increase. And I think there's a massive viewpoint that we've got to start to really measure our business properly, rather than just measure it by that placement's worth 10 grand, not realizing how much of that 10 grand disappears and what's actually left of that 10 grand.
Absolutely right.
Question 4 then. Most recruiters who want to move to a retained model assume the challenge is persuading the client to agree it. You could argue the bigger problem is that they're trying to have the conversation at exactly the wrong moment, which is exactly with exactly the wrong person, and they have done nothing in the last 6 months before that conversation to make the yes inevitable. Where are agencies going wrong before the conversation starts? And what does the groundwork actually look like when done properly, when trying to sell a different service or a retained service?
Well, I think you've got to ask yourself the obvious sales question that we're all taught. What problem are you, the consultant, the agency, the owner, what problem are you trying to solve for the client? Do you really understand their hiring process and what goes on? And if their hiring process is, to use the phrase, a little bit all over the place, they're using lots of agencies, there's lots of dropouts, candidate control isn't as good, if that's still a problem for the client, then you have a solution. And if you have a good relationship with the person who signs off the invoices or makes the hiring, whoever that is within the organization, and however big the organization is, the retained model, you can talk about value, you can talk about cost of sale, you can talk about the service element of it. And it makes sense for you and the client to have that conversation and engage and go down that route. But if you don't understand any of those dynamics, it's very difficult as an agency just to say, I tell you what, we're going to offer retained. And you go and have 10 conversations with 10 clients and they're not interested in, even though it may make sense, they're not interested because the loyalty factor isn't there. The discussion about how beneficial it is to the client to offer this service, it's just missing. You've decided, you know what, I'm just going to do something different because I need to make a bit more money. Well, there's logic in that because you do need to make a bit more money. But unless you've wrapped it up in actually this is the benefit to you, to the client, and then go back to your consultants and explain the benefit to the consultants so that they are also executing on those conversations with the client and saying, actually, um, McLaren, we want to do some work with you, but we believe that we offer an elite service. You're an elite brand. You're looking for elite candidates. This is the best way to get them. And if you can have that conversation, then the service offering of retained or search, whatever you want to call it, is a much better viable option. But you've got to do the work beforehand, because otherwise it just becomes a bit of a logic step of actually, I think this is a really good thing to do. Now we're going to do it, but without doing the work.
It's an interesting conversation, isn't it, about fees, whether it be a perm fee, whether it be a temp margin, or whether it be a preferred supplier list, or whatever it be. And I think the prerequisite, if I could say the word, is straightforward. The client needs to trust you before the conversation starts. And I think a lot of recruitment agencies think we have trust and loyalty with our clients when all we have is a transactional relationship. And therefore, when we start that conversation of negotiating a different service, a different fee, etc., we tend to lose out because you don't have the relationship. What you have is you are just a supplier with a supplier's number, and that's all you are. And I think, again, we tend to negotiate, and I've said this before, we negotiate at the wrong time. So when we're trying to renegotiate a perm fee, we try to renegotiate it when they're giving us a perm job. Again, when the contract business comes to you with lots of contractors, we try to up the fees or try to change the margin, etc., from there. But they have that pressing need. Same with a temp margin. When we're talking about more compliance or different in taxes that are coming in and we're charging that, in every case, and when we look at it, when we try and do those, it's because we have a pressing need, but they have the power. When we need to change that round, and I think the clients that will never agree retained or never accept a fair temp margin or a contract fee, then we've got to start to think, do we really want to work with those clients? But that means we've got to flip and work harder on our new business development and find clients that are really worth working for. And again, we tend to fear that there's a good margin coming from that client, there's a good reasonable fee coming from that client, but they're a pain, they're a problem, etc. We never think about removing that because we get complacent and we get comfortable from there. So I think moving from retained on perm or defending your markup on temp or protecting your contract margins, a client who sees you as a partner rather than as a supplier, and you build that trust, will accept the conversation about increases in fees, margins, etc. And if you have that conversation way before they have the need, they're more likely to accept that conversation and accept that reason than actually when they have the need, when they're going to reject it because they need the needs. And I think all agencies have grown fees across all of those three service lines, have not done it by better negotiation. They've done it by making themselves more genuinely difficult to replace before the negotiation starts. Yeah. And I think that's the thing that we tend to think we've got this relationship with a client that's based on trust, loyalty, and advocacy, when actually we haven't got that relationship. And that's because they've got 4 or 5 other agencies that they can go to because we've not made ourselves we've made ourselves replaceable. We haven't made ourselves irreplaceable at the start. And I think that's the thing that we tend to forget. We need to make ourselves irreplaceable. So if you're in a preferred supplier with 4 other agencies, that's going to be a really hard sell. If you're in a working relationship with a client and the client is using it on a contingency basis, irrespective of what market it is, okay, you haven't got a deep enough relationship with the client, because if you had, you'd be doing it as a sole supply agreement.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we talk about agencies protecting their fees having 3 things in common: tighter sector focus, deeper client relationships, and the ability to prove the ROI with any financial director, CFO, etc. in the business. Okay. Most agencies would say that they already have those things, but what does it actually look like when you have them at a level that changes what the clients will pay versus having a level that is just good enough to keep the relationship going?
Well, I think it's such a good question, Harry, because the reality is, whatever we say, if you're running an agency and you've got between, say, 5 and 15 staff, which is a lot of UK companies, you may have on your books 50 clients, maybe 100 clients that you build something with in the last 2 years. The reality is 10 or 20 of those at the max are the ones that they're your favorite client, you're their favorite client, perhaps, or hopefully. So when we're talking about CFO relationship or senior board relationship, it's not with your clients, it's with a percentage of your clients that may make up 50, 60, 70% of your revenue. Yeah, when we do the audits that we do, when we go into and meet new clients, now typically they've got 10 really good clients, and then they've got a list of other people that they do business with. In order to have a relationship with a CFO, CEO, whoever, um, even on those 10 top 10 clients, you're not going to have a relationship with the CFO. If you're dealing with McLaren, it's highly unlikely that the CFO of McLaren is going to talk to a recruitment company. That's not to in any way undermine the service that we do, which I'm very proud of, but that's the reality. You'll be dealing with somebody who is accountable for delivering the recruitment service. To get to that type of relationship, you've got to show that what you do is valuable. You give them the reports that's going on. You tell them news what's going on. You go to events where they're at, and you get closer to them, and you begin to understand what is it, what is the pulse of their business, and how the service that you provide can help that pulse be maintained or drive faster. And that takes time, and that takes work, and that takes intelligence, and that takes commitment from the owners or the management or the leadership team to really get to understand. And if you're running your business on how many placements have you made today, how many calls have you made today, why are you late, what's going on, all the usual day-to-day stuff which we absolutely get involved in as business owners, but you're not spending at least 20% of your time looking outside of the business and thinking, how can I craft some of these relationships? Then you're always going to be stuck in, I'm one of the recruiters and I'm dealing with those companies. So I think you've got to work at those relationships. And it may not be the CFO, it may be somebody else within the business, but somebody's got to work at that.
That's an interesting way of sort of thinking about it. I think there's also that sort of thing that the three things protecting your fees are not the skills that we develop as recruiters. There are the positioning strategies that take probably 18 to 24 months to build across a business. And that means talking to people like the CFO, talking to the CEO, talking to the higher people, rather than talking to the recruitment line from there. So if you think about those three service lines, which is why precisely most agencies have started either a perm or contract or temp, but we're too busy filling the next role at whatever margin we can that the client agreed last time, rather than thinking about how can we change that. And I think your best temp client probably sees you as a shift filling service. Your best contract client probably sees you as a sourcing function. And your best perm client probably sees you as a recruiter. However, not one of them probably sees you as a strategic partner. And the gap between how they see you and how you see yourself is entirely the difference between the current fee and the fees that you could be charging. And if they don't see you as a partner, then you've got a problem. So the proof's not in of the ROI is not in the same conversation as your service line. On perm, it's the retention of rate of your staff and the commercial impact of a great hire. Do we ever mention the commercial impact of a great hire? And I've mentioned this before. I've got one client that has a two-fee structure. So they have a low fee for the placement of the candidate on perm. And then if the candidate in a year makes X, Y, Z for the company in money, then they take a percentage of that earnings. And so some of their fees are astronomical because some of the clients that they work with are putting big salespeople in the banking marketplace. But that's a very different way because they're
Yeah.
taking their fee based on the commercial impact that that hire has. So it makes it more prevalent for them to put a really good person in. On temp, you know, is it, do we ever measure shift fill rate, the compliancy record, and the cost per head versus running understaffed for a client? So if you're running understaffed, what does that cost you? On contracts, it's the same: the time to deploy, the quality of the delivery, the day rate benchmark against what the client would pay on the open market. Most agencies only make a perm argument. The ones growing fees across all three sectors are making an argument for all three areas why they're doing that. And usually, when I talk to temp agencies and contract agencies, they're not making an argument based on the commerciality of what those candidates are doing for the client, etc. It's just based on the speed of delivery and the quality of the candidate. They never think about taking that further. So deep relationships look very different across those three sectors. And I think that's what we've got to start to think about. But when we start to speak to the higher end of the marketplace, not the service line, they are really interested in the ROI that we are producing. And I have helped clients go and talk to senior managers in certain businesses about the ROI and explain the ROI. And even CFOs and CEOs are gone, I've never thought it about that way. I've never thought about how much that candidate makes us over a 2-year period or a 3-year period. And therefore, that now makes your fee look almost minuscule compared to what I'm getting from the quality that you've got. And I think that's the bit that we've got to start to look at. And that's the bit that we've got to start to really grow and move. So that phrase, prove your ROI, in the language that a finance director, CEO, CFO understands, sounds pretty straightforward. But most recruiters have never had a conversation with the CEO or the CFO because they're speaking to the recruitment line. What does that language actually sound like in a fee negotiation or retain pitch? And how does a recruiter who spent their career talking to hiring managers start to make the shift without feeling completely sort of unnatural, or, you know, it's a market I don't want to talk to, it's a person I don't want to talk to, I feel completely uncomfortable talking to that person?
Well, most recruiters don't speak to the CEO, the CFO, the CPO, whoever it is, and nor should they. That's not their job. That's the job of the CEO, the CFO, the CPO of the agency. You have to have matched relationships. If you're a sales consultant at a recruitment company, I never expected my sales consultant to pick up the phone to the CEO of a company and have those sort of conversations. Yeah? Now, as they get more skilled, as they get more business intelligence and more intuitive, and they have things to tell the market and tell the CEO, then that's fine. But my expectation was never that they would do that. But my expectation was that I would, if I'm running a 15-person recruitment company and our relationship is at a senior level. I'm not talking about the head of RBS or NatWest or whatever it is. I'm talking about somebody senior within the organization. I would expect to have that relationship. And what I find out, and I think we've had this conversation before, many senior business leaders who've grown excellent businesses but are now facing more challenging times don't own a mirror relationship with clients at the senior level of that you'd expect them to do. They may know of them, they may send them emails, but they don't have that sort of relationship. And that's the difference between understanding what drives the client's business and how you fit into that and just becoming another supplier. The ones that are winning are the ones that are helping and can demonstrate that they're helping companies grow. If I provide you 3 engineers, this is what it's going to make to the project. But we talk about CFOs as if they're driven by ROI, and of course that is a measurement, but also they want success for their company. They want to know that if you're providing 4 engineers and this project it arrives 6 weeks early or doesn't arrive 3 weeks late, and it's your people that have done that, that's beautiful language to have a conversation with a CFO. You don't have to talk about necessarily ROI. You can just talk about where the people that provide these people. recruitment in the UK sometimes undersells itself because we don't think that what we do matters as much as, say, what an engineer does for a company. Yeah, but absolutely it does, as long as you can convey that. And that takes training, that takes time, that takes understanding.
It's a very interesting conversation, isn't it? And you said that we shouldn't be speaking to CFOs, CEOs, etc., etc. Maybe the owners of the business should be speaking to those people. And I think that most CFOs probably don't know who those recruiters are.
Yeah,
But how many
no,
times do I hear every single day from clients that we're working with? Oh, I've just lost a client. Why? A new CFO's arrived and he's stopped using recruitment. He's stopped doing this. A new HR person's arrived. They stopped doing this, etc., etc. So we're getting stopped. Okay. However, they probably know your last three invoices. But if they can't connect those invoices to a business outcome, an ROI, then they've got no understanding of what that business actually does. And so we talk about the answers to the last question, in what you're measuring and what you're then talking to your client about at the higher end, then that language is a very different language rather than them just thinking you're a service line and a costly service line at that, because all they see is the figures, they don't see anything else. So I think if you think about most recruiters, a 25% fee sounds really expensive, which it does, doesn't it?
yeah, of course, of course.
Until you put it next to a six-figure bad hire and what that costs. A 20% temp markup sounds expensive until you start to talk to them about how many uncovered shifts have you had? How many people are you having to replace every single day on site because they're not capable of doing the job because you've gone to a cheaper agency and got cheaper workforce, etc. Talk about that compliance conversation. Then think about a 15% contract margin sounds expensive until you put it next to a 6 week waste of internal resources, effort, doing the role that's delayed a
Yeah,
project.
yeah,
All of a sudden, that is what the CEO, the CFO understands. So if you spent your time, well, if you spent all your time speaking to the hiring manager, then when those roles changed above and nobody understands what your value is, that is when you start to get cut. When a business starts to get tight and they don't understand the value, that's when they challenge your margin. That's when they challenge your fees, because it's not the recruitment line that's challenging your fees. That challenge comes way above. And if we're not having the right conversations with those people, then we are always on the back foot, because your fill rate doesn't count to them. They are looking at what the risk is and they're looking at the commercial output for their business. And I think most recruiters are terrified of that fee conversation because they don't believe in their own value. They genuinely don't believe in their value. And that is true whether the conversation is about a perm performance or a perm percentage, a temp markup or a contract margin. It's the self-worth problem before it's a pricing problem. And I think if we start to understand our own self-worth and how we measure that, then we may be able to start to fix the negotiation from a training point of view, and who should be having that conversation with those people than just it's a recruitment fee and I'm worried about that conversation. And I think we all have seen that. I've seen that through my 30 odd years of recruitment constantly, that we are terrified of that fee conversation. Last question then. If an agency leaves this website today and commits to shift their fee model from contingency to retained over the next 12 months, irrespective of what that model is, what does the first 90 days actually look like in practice? And what's the biggest mistake they're most likely to make in that window? And how do you hold themselves accountable to the plan when the temptation is always to fall back on old habits? Because that's always the strongest habit that there is.
First things first, for clarity, go back to the plan that you're working to. Where does retain fit into that? If it doesn't, do you need to change that plan? And how are you going to hold yourself accountable for turning your business or adding a new service to your business, whatever language you want to use. You've got to have a plan and you've got to know where it fits into that plan. Second, do a skills mapping exercise for your consultants. Which are the ones that can adapt to the new way of working, the new skill, the new retained service that you're offering, and what do they need? What type of training do they need? Because you need to instill that in them and you need to encourage them. Do you need to reward them differently? They will behave how they are rewarded. So what is it that you need to reward? So there's a few things to look at. And you need to show some sort of evidence of expertise. So if you're moving to that retained model, um, what is the benefits of the client of the retained model? Have some answers, have a list of things, the cost of hiring, the speed of hiring, the patience of hiring if you're trying to find the right person. Make sure that within those first 90 days, you've got the answers to all those questions, that your team is on board, and that if you're working to a plan and your team understands that plan, you can now say, well, actually, we've got another service. We've added this service, and this is why. And do the role plays, the old-fashioned role plays of, play the client, play the candidate, play the agency, the agent, and make sure you get it under the skin so everybody knows it's something that you can do quite well. All that can be achieved in 90 days.
I think one of the biggest mistakes people make in that first 90 days is if you've only got one service line, fix that service line. If you've got multiple service lines, as in perm, contract, or temp, and two of those or three of those, etc., it's only fixing one and ignoring the rest. And I think if you start on temp, you should start by identifying where your clients are filling the most shifts at the lowest margin. Those are not your best clients. They're your most expensive clients for you to work with because the cost of it, filling those those roles are higher. So you work on that. So renegotiating one of those accounts in the first 90 days or walking away from it is probably worth more than three perm placements at a higher fee. So you've got to start to think about what you're doing on contract. Have the preferred supplier conversation with your three most established clients before they have live requirements, before they have live projects coming on. That conversation is always harder when there's roles on the table. But having that conversation about going from a preferred supplier going to a sole supplier is always better when you have the cards. So you're supplying the majority of the people into that business. You understand what's coming down the chain. You're building a pipeline of candidates from that. So rather than waiting for the next instruction and having it, it's having that conversation early. Okay. And on perm, the business pitch changes every sort of day, but every new client from this point is pitched on a retained or exclusive level rather than on the old contingency level. So now it's not as upgrade later. It's now about upgrading your new services for your new clients and then thinking about which of your old clients can you do that to. And we'll go back to that 18-month strategy. And I worked this with a solo business and she wanted to go to pure exclusively. And we said, right, okay, or I said to her, right, let's look at what service you provide now and what you're providing to the client. And I said, you're providing just contingency, and therefore you've got a contingent relationship. Over the next 18 months, we changed that relationship. She then went to all of her clients and said, as of today, everything will be retained. If you don't want to work with me on a retained basis, then I will not be working on your roles. She lost one client. Yeah. That client came back to her 3 months later because they realized the worth. But what we'd spent was 18 months showing the clients our work. We had a genuine project to go from A to B and get to where you want. So 90 days is the start of that project, but it takes 12 months to make that shift. It takes 18 months to them to really understand what your true value is worth. So if you're trying to shift today from one to another, it's going to probably fall on their deaf ears because they do not trust you and they do not see your value because you haven't provided that information for them. And that goes back about data and how powerful your data can be and what you're using your data for. It's not just about fill rates, it's about the commerciality of what you're doing with the client and how that client works. Ladies and gents, thanks very much for your time. It's been much appreciated. Dave, thanks for your time. Next week, we are going to have a webinar. At the moment, we're just unsure of what's going on due to the fact that we were going to have some AI experts on from the training side of AI rather than selling a product or a service. Okay. However, they've just dropped a line, so they've just landed a massive training contract, which they have to start to deliver next week. So if they can get some time, they'll be with us. If not, then we will find another service or another product that we'll talk about and how we'll work on that. But if we can get them, then we will be having that conversation of how to use AI properly and how to train yourself to use AI rather than just the generic AI conversation that everyone else is having at the moment. Dave, thanks for your time. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks so much for attending. Much appreciated. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope the summer doesn't get too much hotter where you are, because it's meant to be not as hot as a couple of weeks ago, but it's meant to be a longer heat wave. Ladies and gents, thanks very much. Goodbye.
Thanks, everybody.